In the meantime, though, the Biden administration is not waiting. It has declared war on domestic terror. You may be in that category. We know because the administration has released a document called the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. It reads like a manual for targeting the administration's political opponents, because that's exactly what it is. And if there's one story you should pay attention to this year, it's this one. It could affect you. Nicholas Giordano has studied the document. He studied a lot of American government documents. He's an associate professor of political science at Suffolk Community College and the host of the P.A.S report. He joins us now. Professor, thanks so much for coming on. We want to talk to you because you, unlike most people in the media, have actually read this document. This document comes from the White House. The first page has Joe Biden's signature on it. Tell us what it says and what it means.
Well, this is actually one of the most concerning documents I've ever read that was authored by government officials. And when you look at it, it's clear that the analysts in the field, they didn't write this document. It was the political appointees trying to push an agenda. They list 3 factors that drive domestic terrorism. The first factor is racism. And when you look at it, they never really define racism except for white supremacy, of course, and the superiority of white race. And these are the same people that believe that racism is inherent. You're born with it. So if racism is inherent, the question is, are we born domestic terrorists? But it goes deeper than that. Then it talks about anti-government sentiment and anti-authority sentiment. And this is where it gets dangerous. The anti-government sentiment, if you call for small, limited government, if you criticize the government in any way, are you going to be deemed as someone that has anti-government sentiment? Anti-authority. If you question government powers, if you push back against the government, if you look at the coronavirus and you question the mandates that came out as unconstitutional, well, now you're classified as anti-authority. And just think back, over 1,200 public health officials a year ago signed a letter stating that if you protest lockdowns, that's white nationalism. So we have these vague terms that are being used that really could encompass anything. In the document, it talks about violence. Now, we all abhor violence. Violence should not be tolerated in any way. But this document goes much further than that. It talks about incitement and what can incite domestic terrorism. And it doesn't give any explanation except for the fact that the government, the powers that be, will determine what incitement is. But on page 10, it talks about a few examples. If you question the 2020 election and bring up the idea of election fraud, if you talk about COVID and question the mandates that came out, or conspiracies, engage in what the government deems conspiracies, that could incite domestic terrorism, and therefore you can get punished for it. So if you put out a tweet talking about election fraud, are you now going to be targeted and labeled a domestic terrorist? So then the document lays out the 4 pillars in how it's going to combat, push back against domestic terrorism. You see widespread monitoring of American civilians. You see a partnership with big tech, the financial sector, to give up Americans' private information. You see censorship. It talks about the supply and demand of information online, and that means that it has to limit it through censorship. It talks about encouraging individuals and families, trying to recruit them. And when we look at that, well, what do they mean by that? I remember in Vermont when a governor tried to do that. So we see these abuses take place, but it's a political agenda. That's what's being pushed. And Pillar 4 talks about the agenda of pushing it for gun violence and CRT and equity.
It's a fascist document. I mean, that's what you're describing. And they're pushing the country towards something awful. This country was very divided on Election Day. They've made it still more divided. And I think it's starting to scare people, including me.